Thank you, Father Antonio, very much. And thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak to you this afternoon. It's always a delight to come to the Institute and be amongst such good friends and colleagues. And thank you for taking the time to come. Yeah, don't trust the technology, obviously, and hopefully it won't break down. What I'd like to do this afternoon is talk about the question of teleology in relation to the debate concerning nature and grace. This is part of a much bigger project called Creation's Ends, Teleology, Ethics and the Natural, that deals with the problem of teleology in natural philosophy and its supposed demise in early modern thought, and whether it is recoverable and in what sense in our own time. Because I do think that the question of teleology is the key question when it comes to the science-religion debate, science-theology debate, because it's the one thing as theologians, of course, we can't concede, and yet it's the one thing that modern natural science claims it doesn't observe in nature. So what I want to do is talk this afternoon about the particularly theological dimension of this question in relation to nature and grace. So one of the common ways of narrating the transition from the medieval world to modernity is in terms of the demise of teleology, of final causes and purpose, in favour of a particular view of efficient causation. We often cite Francis Bacon's Novum Organum of 1620 to the effect that final causes are barren and proper scientific explanation is possible only in terms of efficient causes. In fact, we know that the historical transition from the Middle Ages to modernity is more complex, particularly with respect to the understanding of nature and causation. The natural philosophers or physico-theologians of the 17th and 18th centuries did not reject final causes, but reconceived the purposes of natural things in terms of human utility. So, for example, in 1688, Robert Boyle, perhaps the greatest of England's 17th century experimenters, published his treatise, A Disquisition about the Final Causes of Natural Things, in which he gave particular expression to a teleology of nature. So Boyle writes, there are not many subjects in the whole compass of natural philosophy that better deserve to be inquired into by Christian philosophers than that which is discoursed of in the following essay. For certainly it becomes such men to have curiosity enough to try at least whether it can be discovered that there are any knowable final causes to be considered in the works of nature. Since if we neglect this inquiry, we live in danger of being ungrateful in overlooking the uses of things that may give us just cause of admiring and thanking the author of them, and of losing the benefits relating as well to philosophy as piety that the knowledge of them may afford us. What emerges in this period is not the wholesale rejection of teleology, but a teleological view of nature centered on the two central tasks of this new physico-theology. The first was to discern the power and intricate craftsmanship of God in the fabrication of the cosmos, and the second was to discern the usefulness of creatures with respect to human material needs. Together, these provided the purpose and legitimation of the new experimental and mathematical natural philosophy, following the foundation of the Royal Society in 1660. The teleology proposed by the members of the Society, including Boyle and Isaac Newton, concerned utility. God gave us creatures whose end was to meet our material needs. This meant that nature had no intrinsic value or meaning, but only a value in relation to use by humans. When things cease to hold their own value, they only have value in terms of consumption and trade. We have all kinds of nice examples of early modern natural philosophers trying to find uses for apparently completely useless creatures. Perhaps one of the most interesting examples is, in fact, a French Jesuit, Noël Antoine Pluche, who was worried about the use of woodworm. And he decided that woodworm was given to us by God to aid international relations. Of course, it's obvious when you think about it. Woodworm rots the hulls of our ships, and therefore we have to go to the French to buy timber to repair the hulls of our ships. And this aids international trade and international relations. In the context of Brexit, for those of us in the UK, this is terribly important. Yes, Noël Antoine Pluche put this in his treatise Spectacle de la Nature. And there are all kinds of interesting examples of rather strained attempts to find uses for apparently useless creatures. We now have a much clearer picture of the dramatic and complex change that took place in the metaphysics of causation between medieval theology and philosophy of the High Middle Ages and the advent of modern natural philosophy in the 16th and 17th centuries. In fact, the transition did not concern only final causes. It featured the reimagining or disintegration of all four modes into which causation was understood to fall in the Aristotelian tradition. And David Schindler gives a wonderful account of this in his book, The Catholicity of Reason. Of particular importance was the demise of form and its association with natural kinds. Once the notion of formal causation was dissolved by the universal acid of nominalism, to coin a phrase, the notion of an intrinsic purposiveness in nature was lost, and causation could be reimagined as a transaction of material force rather than the communication of form. And this is why the modern metaphysics of causation tends to refer to efficient causes as events that are temporally prior to and coincident with effects, rather than refer to efficient causes as things. The efficient cause of the child is the event of conception, rather than the person of the mother and father who denote the child's form. So, as Michael has argued so clearly and forcefully in his book No God, No Science, the loss of the notion of form is part of the disintegration of wholes and the consequent loss of the organism as the irreducible subject matter of biology and evolution. Recent philosophical attempts to resurrect teleology are problematic insofar as they do not consider form as integral to a coherent notion of final causation. For example, teleonomic and teleomatic understandings of nature are in fact but simulations of teleology that are mechanistic precisely because there is nothing to hold the final cause in nature. Nowhere the final cause can appear in its potential guise before its actualization. What emerges in early modern natural philosophy is not a nature then devoid of final causes, but a hardened dualism between intrinsic and extrinsic teleology. Extrinsic teleology clearly belongs to human artifacts such as cars and photocopiers, because the goal of such machines is not intrinsic to the material nature of the machine itself, but belongs to the intention and design of the maker and operator of the machine. Insofar as matter is conceived as formless, passive stuff, creation becomes an instance of extrinsic teleological design of an artifact in which the design is layered upon material via the laws of nature decreed by the inscrutable divine will. If the notion of intrinsic teleology belongs anywhere in this conception of nature, it is to be found in human conscious intentionality. In this picture, the Aristotelian priority of nature over art is reversed. Art does not imitate nature. Nature is artificial and manipulable in any and every direction. The purely possible is now prior to the actual. The contemporary debate surrounding teleology has been dogged by the dualism between extrinsic and intrinsic final causes. The dualism influences the reading of the entire tradition of reflection on teleological causation, even back to Plato and Aristotle. Plato is regarded as having an unnatural teleology or an extrinsic teleology in the Timaeus. See, for example, the work of James Lennox. Whilst many commentators argue that Aristotle has a purely naturalized teleology where there is no cosmic purpose or genuine creative agency. The problem with this dualism of intrinsic and extrinsic is that if one is to consider God, consider it in theological terms, God is placed on one side or the other as the intentional causal agent lying behind creation's purposes. We end up with pantheism or some kind of deism in which God becomes one causal agent amongst others. Of course, there is a whole metaphysical background to that particular picture: the demise of primary and secondary causation, the dissolution of the analogy of being, the metaphysics of participation, that lies beyond the purview of this paper this afternoon. But what I'd like to explore with you is the importance of the dualism between intrinsic and extrinsic teleology and the concomitant demise of formal causation on the key theological debate concerning the relation between nature and grace. This debate revived more recently with the neo-scholasticism of, amongst others, Lawrence Feingold and Stephen A. Long, is in large part a debate about teleology within the orders of creation and redemption, about the natural and supernatural ends of intentional human beings, how those ends relate, and how they are discerned and how they are achieved. In discussing nature and grace with respect to teleology, I'm going to proceed in 3 phases. The first concerns nature itself. What is it and how does it relate to natural law and human purposes? Following the Aristotelian tradition, we will see that habit mediates between natural ends and human purposes. And secondly, what is grace and how does it relate to nature? And finally, how does a particular attention to final causes shed a little more light on this intractable debate concerning the teleological orientation of humanity to the beatific vision under the motive power of God's charity? But first I'm going to begin with nature. Aristotle's well-known definition of nature focuses on an intrinsic principle of motion and rest, inhering in things essentially and not accidentally. So a heavy object by nature falls, a bird by nature flies, and a human by nature learns. By contrast, a human does not by nature fly, but only flies artificially, as it were, by mimicking that which flies by nature through the invention of and manufacture of aeroplanes. So nature is, on this Aristotelian view, contrasted with human artifice. There is, however, always a blend of intrinsic and extrinsic order. Human artifice must refer to the intrinsic orientation of matter to certain ends and not others, whilst nature's goal and orientation always involves a stretching towards that which lies beyond it. A distinction but not a dualism between nature and artifice must be maintained, for nature is a work of divine art in which creation is made to make itself by the formal natures of creatures. In God's creation, as Aquinas reminds us, it is as if the shipbuilder were able to give to timber that by which they would move themselves to take the form of a ship. And the possibility of human artifice always presupposes that actuality of nature given by God. Now, nature, of course, has been defined as distinct from or standing over and against numerous other categories, not just artifice. Nature and freedom, nature and culture, nature and history, nature and convention, nature and will, nature and grace, or simply the unnatural. As Robert Spemann has pointed out, many early modern natural philosophers, Robert Boyle amongst them, simply reduced nature to what could be observed out there, but eventually saw this as an arena for the exercise of human power or manipulation in accordance with a dominant will. The modern natural sciences are concerned not so much with the question, what is nature, but how does nature work and what can we do with it? So nature is evacuated of ends other than the ones provided that we provide, and as Spemann points out, it is impossible to do violence to a nature that is not ordered to anything. The power to manipulate nature to ends ordained by human beings, eventually commerce and consumption, means that if a person wants to make whatever he pleases out of a thing, then the question about what that thing itself is ordered to can only be a hindrance. So what remains by nature are not natural things, but rather fundamental physical laws, i.e. what Aristotle precisely does not call physis, but rather ananker, necessity. These laws, however, are precisely not able to be simulated in human artifice, but are rather indifferent with respect to the distinction between nature and simulation. What Spemann is pointing to in these essays, written more than 30 years apart, is that nature is evacuated of any proper ends and is therefore evacuated of itself. There is no way of distinguishing between nature and artifice in teleological terms, hence there is no difference between nature and simulated nature. Everything is simulation, a simulation of our own free wills and desires. To put it bluntly, there are no givens, no real and intrinsic natures and purposes. This modern view of nature is of a piece with a view of the natural that sees it as a domain of very fixed, narrow, and determinate natures that are subject to laws of necessity that compel human action. That's slightly counterintuitive. I say of a piece because the understanding of the natural on this view is simply a projection of human will and praxis. The genuine contrast to the modern view of nature, evacuated of forms and purposes, is the more traditional form of natural law expressed by St. Thomas Aquinas. The natural law is, of course, a participation in the eternal law, which is nothing other than the exemplar of a divine wisdom as directing the motions and acts of everything. Aquinas' natural law as a participation in the eternal law is a delicate blend of the intrinsic and the extrinsic, the immanent and the transcendent. So he writes, and we have it here, "Now among all others, the rational creature is subject to divine providence in the most excellent way, insofar as it partakes of a share of providence by being provident both for itself and for others. Wherefore it has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end. And this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. The light of natural reason, whereby we discern what is good and what is evil, which is the function of the natural law, is nothing else than an imprint on us of the divine light. It is therefore evident that the natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation of the eternal law." In this question, Thomas continually refers to natural law as an imprint or an impact on our nature, as something that belongs to our form as creatures. This gives us tendencies that can become habits. The point is that the natural law is not like the laws of nature in early modern thought. It is not a set of juridical commands that stand over and against nature, but is imprinted into the innermost being of things. It is our intrinsic orientation to a participation in the eternal law, an intrinsic orientation that is gifted from the otherness of God. It is written in our hearts. I'll return to Thomas's understanding of natural law in just a moment. Lying on the same trajectory, a more succinct definition of natural law is proposed by Robert Sokolowski, which he in turn borrowed from Francis Slade, and it helps us to identify the moral challenge involved in our relationship to the natural law. The natural law is, says Sokolowski, quite simply, the ontological priority of ends over purposes. What he means by this succinct definition is quite simple. Natural things, birds, trees, frogs, have ends. Human artifacts, cars, houses, furniture, have ends. Human beings also have ends, happiness, for example. But our inclinations and desires give rise to purposes that are entangled with the ends of things. For example, it is clear that the end of the art of medicine is the restoration and preservation of health. On the other hand, we could have all kinds of purposes in practicing the art of medicine, to make a living, to earn esteem in the community, to help the vulnerable and poor to exercise power, or, alas, not an unknown extreme, to develop techniques useful for torture. This is somewhat connected to Aristotle's distinction between the goal as the aim of an action, the end in Sokolowski's case, and the goal as the beneficiary, the purpose. The goal of the art of building is the house. The beneficiary is either the person who lives in the house or the builder who is paid for building the house. But the point that Sokolowski makes is that it takes a high degree of moral discernment to distinguish ends and purposes because they are continually entangled and are often difficult to align. A good example, I think, would be the banking sector in the financial crisis 8 years ago, certainly in the UK. Banking is part of the service sector, and as such, its end is to serve the economy by essentially moving money around. The purposes of bankers may be many and various, but they should not conflict with the ends of banking. Of course, problems arose when purposes, for example, making the greatest profit or shareholder return in the shortest time, were confused for ends. or when bankers fail to recognize that banking has ends that are given in the form of service. In other words, banking is not an end in itself. So with reference to specifically human ends, Sokolowski states that our inclinations and desires give rise to purposes, and sooner or later a conflict arises between what we are and what we want. Of course, the difficulty as highlighted by Spemann and reiterated by Sokolowski is that when nature is evacuated of all ends, we have only untrammeled purposes and a situation of potential considerable violence. By considering natural law as the ontological priority of ends over purposes, Sokolowski is pointing out that our wills are governed by what is given by God in nature, by the natural law imprinted on us. This is not for a moment to suggest that the natural curtails the freedom of the human will, of course not. Rather, the ends of nature in the virtuous person are experienced not as an extrinsic and imposed law of ends, but quite simply as what the person wants to be. So how can purposes, as emerging from the will, be related to ends as discerned by reason? Here I'd like to turn to Aquinas' view of habitus and how this relates to virtue, because Aquinas doesn't see human action arising from a series of discrete interactions of will and intellect, a set of calculations concerned with fitting purposes to ends. Human acts form a life, which is not a succession of discrete states. It is a continuous motion, ultimately towards the universal end in being, truth, and goodness. Human individual deliberative acts cohere to form a narratable life of singular motion towards the good. The motions of our intellective and appetitive soul collect to form habits, and as for the 19th century Aristotelian Felix Ravesson, a habit is a quality and disposition which modifies a being's substance. They differ from other qualities in determining the manner in which a being realizes or fails to realize its own natural ends. A habit as a disposition to good is a disposition to good or evil. In other words, a habit determines the motion of a being towards fulfillment of its telos or away from such fulfillment towards the disintegration of its being. Habits are not, however, mere qualities or accidents of things. Good habits are qualities and accidents of a special kind, which lie at the heart of the nature of a being, and therefore come closest to entering into the essence and definition of a being. Thomas implies that a habit comes about through an appropriate balance of the intellective and appetitive powers of the soul, in such a way that a being takes that quality into its nature. In the case of a good habit, this leads to the greater actualization of that nature. Habits, says Aquinas, may be possessed to a greater or lesser degree. I may have a more or less intense habit of learning or a more or less intense habit of generous living. The word intense is important here, for when Aquinas talks of becoming more knowledgeable, he is not talking about adding facts to our stock, but rather of having a clearer and more ready knowledge. Neither when he talks of becoming more generous does he mean accumulating distinct, discrete quantities of generosity, but rather he means being more readily and easily generous. So Thomas claims that such a habit gives spontaneity, it gives delight, assurance, readiness to the motions of intellect and will. From all of which it can be seen that we need the habit of virtues in order that perfect activity might be pleasantly accomplished. This results from habit which, since it acts in the manner of a kind of nature, makes the activity proper to it, as it were, natural and consequently delightful. A person has the habit of love, for example, and moves spontaneously and readily to operative loving, just as a fire spontaneously and readily moves upwards. This is an understanding of ethics to which virtue theorists have frequently pointed in their recent work. For Aquinas, the good life is not one which involves the effort of overcoming temptations and heroically acting well. Neither is the good life reactive. A natural body requires no occasion to behave according to its nature, so too the good human life should not require an occasion to act lovingly or generously. And finally, the genuinely good life is not characterized by ponderous and calculative moral deliberations. It appears spontaneous and swift, because good actions spring from good habits which are infused into and define our nature, just as the motions of natural bodies appear swift and easy as bodies move towards their telos. So by means of habit, the ends of nature come to be interwoven with and direct our purposes, not by means of a discrete series of events, but to form a single and coherent life which is orientated towards those ends. But there is one end to which all of humanity seems ultimately orientated, but which we are not capable of attaining by our own powers, namely God himself in the beatific vision, for this is the only eternal end which has nothing beyond itself. It is the only thing desirable purely for itself. Why is humanity not of its own accord capable of attaining its ultimate end? Thomas suggests that every form bestowed on created things by God has the power for a determined act which it is capable of bringing to fruition in proportion to its own proper endowment. Because no proportion can be fixed between esse ipsum and esse commune, we cannot by our own natural powers come to see God, despite it being the case that the vision of God is our end, our ultimate end. So God bestows on humanity a second gift, namely grace, by which we move and are moved to our ultimate end in beatitude. We must be clear, however, that humanity has never been without that second gift, according to St. Thomas. In that sense, there has never been a natura pura to which grace is subsequently added. In the Summa, Aquinas asked whether man was created in Eden without grace so that it could be superadded later, and his answer is no. Some say that man was not created in grace, but that it was bestowed on him subsequently before sin. And many authorities of the saints declare that man possessed grace in the state of innocence. But the very rectitude of the primitive state, wherewith man was endowed by God, seems to require that, as others say, he was created in grace. According to Ecclesiastes 7:30, God made man right. Grace is also given as what Aquinas calls an habitual gift, namely a form or nature by which humanity can move and be moved to the supernatural end appointed by God. Just as God provides for creatures not only by moving them to their appropriate ends, but also in bestowing forms and powers by which they make that motion their own, so too God provides his grace by which humanity may make its motion to beatitudo its own. Importantly, with regard to natural bodies, the movements by which they are moved by God become natural and easy to creatures. Natural and easy to creatures. So, importantly, with regard to natural bodies, the movements by which they are moved by God become natural and easy to them. So too, by analogy, does God infuse into such as he moves towards the acquisition of supernatural good, such forms or supernatural qualities, whereby they may be moved by him sweetly and promptly to acquire eternal good. Grace is described explicitly as an efficient and formal cause. It's a particular love whereby God draws the rational creature beyond its nature to an ecstatic participation in the divine good, that motion being sweet and delightful. So what I've described thus far suggests that grace and nature, mediated by habit, are always intertwined and order humanity to a natural end that is enfolded within an eternal end. So why would we think that there is, at least conceptually, if not really, such a thing as a natura pura, where a natural teleology is quite distinct from a supernatural teleology? To this question I now turn with particular reference to Henri de Lubac as the principal exponent of the view that the natural desire for the supernatural means that nature is always, in some way, already graced, and there is therefore always this blending of intrinsic and extrinsic teleology. For de Lubac, the heart of the Christian mystery is paradoxical. Whilst it is the case that humanity could have a purely natural end, it is the case that humanity is created with a natural desire for the supernatural vision of God. Humanity's natural ends are simply intermediate ends, which are enfolded in our natural end. It is this final end which defines our nature. De Lubac writes, "For this desire is not some accident in me. It does not result from some peculiarity, possibly alterable, of my individual being, or from some historical contingency whose effects are more or less transitory. My finality, which is expressed by this desire, is inscribed upon my very being as it has been put into the universe by God. And by God's will, I now have no other genuine end, no end really assigned to my nature or presented for my free acceptance under any guise, except that of seeing God." De Lubac sees that humanity's desire for the supernatural, in not being accidental, is constitutive of human nature. Of course, the vision of God is connatural only to God and cannot be achieved by humanity's natural power, even though the desire for that ultimate end is apparently natural. For Aquinas, following Aquinas, de Lubac insists that a natural desire of any creature cannot be frustrated without twisting and contorting that nature. So to frustrate humanity's desire for the Visio Dei would be to confine humanity to an endless suffering. So it seems that God is obliged to realize the beatific vision because the desire for that vision is innate in humanity's nature, and in being innate, it must be fulfilled. But how could God's realization of humanity's natural desire for the supernatural be a matter of grace, a free gift, and at the same time of obligation? As John Milbank points out, the paradox is for de Lubac only to be entertained, because one must remember that the just requirement for the gift in humanity is itself a created gift. The doctrine of creation underlying this claim is rather complex, but it runs something like this. It is not the case that creation establishes itself as other than God and then makes a claim on God's grace in order to fulfill its natural desire for the supernatural. Why? Because creation is in itself nothing. It is ex nihilo. To put the matter another way, creation's ability to desire and receive the gifts of God is itself a gift. There is nothing that stands outside this economy of the divine gratuity. What creation has is genuinely its own, but what belongs to creation is always a gift. The innate and natural desire of humanity for the beatific vision does not constitute an obligation which is external to God, lying outside the divine economy of gratuitous creation, because that desire also finds its ultimate source in God. Of course, that natural desire for the supernatural is genuinely the creature's own, but its ultimate first cause is God. Humanity's just requirement for the genuinely new second gift of grace, which will bring humanity to the beatific vision, must be understood as, and here I'm quoting John, beyond all justice and requirement, because that just requirement emerges from a natural desire for the supernatural, which is God's first gift in creation. Put more simply, humanity renounces any claim upon God because its primary nature is receptivity to the divine gift, first of being and secondly of beatitude. As St. Paul puts it in Scripture, "For who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you received it, why do you boast as if it were not a gift?" The view that the natural desire for the supernatural is a gift of God, however, carries with it an obvious danger. It seems to turn everything into a matter of grace and rids human nature of any integrity. Of course, this is precisely the concern of those who maintain the need for a natura pura, namely the preservation of the gratuity of grace. Yet we must hold fast to the paradox of the natural desire for the supernatural. According to creation ex nihilo, creation is the first gift of an existence that is other than God, while grace is the second and wholly new gift of deification, in which humanity is united to God without losing creaturely integrity. The natural desire for the supernatural is the gift of the bond between the first and second gifts, a kind of graced natural habitus. So the natural desire for the supernatural is a suspended middle, to coin Balthasar's phrase, which in turn is borrowed from Eric Pijoara, that indicates the unity and distinction of the orders of grace and nature. In a now famous letter to Maurice Blondel in 1932, de Lubac asks, "This concept of a pure nature runs into great difficulties, the principal one of which seems to me to be the following. How can a conscious spirit be anything other than an absolute desire for God? It is conscious spirit that stands in a suspended middle that cannot be simply a part of nature or purely a matter of grace." So what is conscious spirit? Is it something natural and supernatural? It is something natural and supernatural, human and divine. Spirit is conscious of continuously receiving itself as gift. This is more than a feeling of absolute dependence. It's the drive to know the source of what we are as recipient spirits, who cannot fully comprehend what is received, because a gift must always flow, continually giving itself anew. The response is gratitude towards the mysterious and unfathomable source of that infinite gift. For de Lubac, the debate concerning grace and nature had significant implications for the relation between faith and reason, the sacred and the secular, the church and the state. The neo-scholastic concept of grace standing alongside a realm of natura pura mirrors for him, of course, an understanding of the church standing outside the worldly and autonomous domain of the secular, delivering grace from outside according to the mechanism of its sacraments. The notion of a natura pura is coterminous with the modern establishment of the secular as a desacralized, autonomous and neutral order to which the sacred is added as an extrinsic addition. By contrast, for de Lubac, grace is not an extrinsic power applied to autonomous nature. The natural desire for the supernatural means that grace works by a divine influentia in nature. De Lubac outlines the implications of this vision in an early essay. He says, "The law of the relations between nature and grace is in its generality everywhere the same. It is from within that grace grasps nature. It is from within that grace grasps nature, and far from diminishing nature, raises it up in order to make it serve its own ends." The understanding of grace grasping nature from within is a clear rejection of what de Lubac calls the extrinsicist understanding of grace that can be seen in the writings of early modern thinkers and brought to fruition in the theology of neo-scholasticism. It's possible to see that the neo-scholastic position opposed by de Lubac requires a strict distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic teleology. A natura pura has an intrinsic orientation towards certain natural ends that are largely concerned with self-sufficiency and self-regulation, and hence come to be intelligible in somewhat mechanistic terms. To this is added a desire for the supernatural that is elicited and is therefore extrinsic in origin, even though it comes to reside in nature. Thus there are two ends that run parallel, one intrinsic and purely natural, the things that are proportionate to human nature, such as making dwellings and supplying food, and the other extrinsic and supernatural, the visio Dei. But it's not clear how, if at all, these dual orders relate. That means that the extrinsic supernatural end can be seen as an arbitrary and unintelligible addition to the purely natural and self-sufficient ends of human beings. The supernatural end becomes a focus for superstition, and it leaves behind a largely autonomous secular realm of the purely natural. For de Lubac, humanity's orientation towards the supernatural end, in the sense of being an intrinsic or innate desire, imprinted or impacted on us, as Aquinas said, it is blended with the extrinsic because it is an orientation to what is transcendent that is achieved only through the second gift of grace. It's by grace that God enables the human creature to be moved and to move itself towards its supernatural end. So the teleological motion towards God is both God's and genuinely the creature's own, made sweet and delightful, as Aquinas puts it, by God's grace. So for de Lubac, the very form of humanity is always a teleological orientation towards the beatific vision. He says, my finality, which is expressed by this desire for the vision of God, is inscribed upon my very being, as it has been put into this universe by God. The key point of dispute concerns the more exclusively extrinsic nature of human teleology, conceived by neo-scholasticism. So Reinhard Hutter, for example, says that the second gift of grace begins by initially ordering the first gift of created human nature to a supernatural end, an end it didn't previously have in any guise, and then perfecting that nature in beatitude. So both acts are, as it were, extrinsically ordering human nature to a supernatural end in such a way that humanity becomes passive, and its beatitude a matter of design. According to de Lubac, the first gift of created human nature is always teleologically ordered to a supernatural end that is paradoxically beyond all proportion to human nature. Blended with this intrinsic teleological orientation is the second gift of grace that brings that desire to fruition. As Aquinas puts it, an often quoted phrase now, when an end is beyond the capacity of the agent striving to attain it, it is looked for from another's bestowing. So it's the form of the human desire for the supernatural. This emphasis on form is open to an important objection articulated by Lawrence Feingold. If the form is indeed the final cause, this implies that the addition of a new form, known as grace, will also bring with it a new final telos. So Feingold states, we cannot conclude that because God has destined man for an end that is above his nature, such an end must thereby be a finality imprinted on the nature itself, or an intrinsic or ontological end, or an essential finality. All that we can conclude is that if God has eternally destined us to a supernatural end, it is fitting that he give a new form added on to our nature, by which we are suitably ordered to that supernatural end. This new accidental form, which is sanctifying grace, must necessarily be above our nature so as to make us proportionate to an end above our nature, connatural only to God. Now, as Nicholas Healy points out in an article in Communio, the text to which Feingold appeals for this point in the Summa Contra Gentiles does not support the view that the addition of the form of grace provides humanity with a new final end. As Nick points out, in the passage from the Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas is particularly concerned to argue that sanctifying grace is a form and perfection remaining in man even when he is not acting. In other words, sanctifying grace is not simply a force acting externally on the human person. It is a power that becomes the person's own, and in which the person is settled through a transformed nature, not merely transformed activity. Form for Aquinas is complex and may be qualified or added to. The addition of the new form of grace perfects natural form. It doesn't destroy it or supplant it. The basic natural orientation of humanity to its final end is qualified by the addition of a genuinely new form called grace. Humanity is now able to move and be moved to its final end in response to its natural formal desire for that end. Now, a number of commentators, including Nick and Aaron Riches, clarifying further the basic contours of de Lubac, trace much of the dispute concerning grace and nature to different deployments of Aristotle's maxim that the end of nature must be proportionate to nature. For neo-scholastic theologians, this maxim applies both to the desire for an end and the power to achieve that end. Both our desire for an end and our power to achieve it must be proportionate to our nature. But crucially, Aquinas' view of providence and grace includes two elements. First, degrees of potency to a given end, and secondly, a hierarchy of ends in which the lower participate in the higher. So whilst there is a sense in which humanity is in potency to beatitude as its final end, that potency is radical because it takes the form of a desire that cannot be fulfilled except by God's grace. Yet at no point is humanity neutral or indifferent with respect to the vision of God. Therefore, it cannot be neutral or indifferent to the means of achieving that vision, namely grace. Meanwhile, humanity has two ends, one natural and another ultimate or supernatural, but these are not parallel or separate. They are non-contrastive in the sense that humanity's natural end is enfolded in the ultimate end of beatitude. For de Lubac, expounding a text from Aquinas' Summa, humanity's beatitude is twofold. First, we have an imperfect beatitude that belongs to this world, and secondly, we have a true and perfect beatitude that is the vision of God obtained only by grace, even though that perfect beatitude is desired by nature. According to Thomas, the first beatitude is associated with the contemplation of divine things that we find in ancient philosophy, that indicates a desire for the visio Dei possessed by the blessed that comes only by the grace of God in Christ. The desire that leads to the contemplative life is fulfilled, but not supplanted, only in the vision of the first truth, namely God. For Nicholas Healy, a key implication of de Lubac's position on nature and grace is that the primary form of humanity is receptivity, the exemplary instance of this being Mary's fiat in the Incarnation. This is also an affirmation of the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, in which the first gift of created reality, the reception of being, is consummated in receptivity to theosis. The natural desire for the supernatural is therefore a recognition that the creature in itself is nothing and receives its being at every moment. So this leads to the renunciation of any demand on God. It's not, however, a passive receptivity, because it is also a positive yearning for the utterly gratuitous and unmerited friendship of God. With an emphasis on receptivity as well as donation, this view supplements very effectively Milbank's appropriation of de Lubac focused on gift as a fundamental theological category. Milbank offers an extension of de Lubac's theology because the gift of grace and the receptivity of nature do not constitute only a theological anthropology and soteriology, but also a fundamental doctrine of creation. In the debate concerning the relationship between nature and grace, we therefore have two apparently distinct approaches to the teleological order of creation, and both claim a Thomist heritage. On the one hand, we have a natural law imprinted into nature, which is a participation in the eternal law. In the human spirit, that participation takes the form of a natural desire for the supernatural end of the beatific vision achieved by grace. But grace is a form which perfects the existing natural form of human beings. The blending of intrinsic and extrinsic teleology is perfectly clear. On the other hand, we have the neo-scholastic proposal of a natura pura, to which divine grace is superadded in the form of an elicited desire for the beatific vision. This apparently guarantees the gratuity of grace. But for Feingold, the new form of grace is not intrinsic or essential to the creature, it remains accidental. In being accidental, it apparently preserves its gratuitous status. But in conclusion, I'd like to outline why I find this neo-scholastic position ultimately very unpersuasive, for reasons that concern precisely the metaphysics of form and finality. And it concerns this very dense text from the Secunda Secundae of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. And this is where I'm going to finish this afternoon. Thomas says this: nature is compared to charity, which is the principle of merit, as matter to form, whereas faith is compared to charity as the disposition which precedes the ultimate form. Now it is evident that the subject or the matter cannot act save by virtue of the form, nor can a preceding disposition before the advent of the form. But after the advent of the form, both the subject and the preceding disposition act by virtue of the form, which is the chief principle of action, even as the heat of fire acts by virtue of the substantial form of fire. Accordingly, neither nature nor faith can, without charity, produce a meritorious act. But when accompanied by charity, the act of faith is made meritorious thereby, even as an act of nature and a natural act of the free will. Now, this article concerns whether it's meritorious to believe. So it's about faith in relation to our attainment of our final end. Thomas is concerned particularly with the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, virtues which we cannot generate ourselves, but which are a gift of divine grace. By nature, Aquinas means here in this article human nature, but human nature is related analogically to the whole of the created order, for human nature stands at the centre of that order. I take it that the point he wishes to make is this: the relationship between nature and charity, or love, understood as a theological virtue that is grace, is analogous to the relationship between matter and form. Matter and form constitute a dynamic unity, distinguishable only conceptually. So nature and love form a dynamic unity, distinguishable only conceptually. Faith is a preceding disposition, something which is not complete in itself, but looks for something more. So the dynamic substantial unity of matter and form in any creature acts by virtue of its form. The form contains within itself the final cause in its potential and eventually actual guise. The form is the final cause. So if nature is akin to matter and love is akin to form, what Aquinas wishes to say is that nature acts through its form, which is charity preceded by faith. We act through our form, which is love. But the love of God written in our hearts is not distinguishable from our nature any more than form is detachable from matter. So while we can distinguish, we cannot separate. We might say that habit mediates between nature and charity, for charity is a theological virtue and a special kind of habit. More to the point, the charity which forms our innermost being is absolutely not accidental. It becomes our own by ever intensifying habituation and contains within itself the intimations of our final end in the beatific vision. To sum all this up, this Thomistic understanding of charity in relation to nature as analogous to matter in relation to form really disintegrates in its intelligibility once you lose the notion of formal causation. And that's really the beginning of the demise of teleology, that in the end comes to affect not just our understanding of nature through the natural sciences, but our very theological vision of our own ultimate end in the beatific vision as well. So thank you very much indeed for your extraordinary patience this afternoon.